Somewhere on the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk, in the freezing dark, there was a cable. It was a Soviet military communications line, and it carried some of the most sensitive traffic in the entire Soviet Union. Orders and reports moving between the Pacific Fleet headquarters and its submarine base on the Kamchatka Peninsula. Much of what traveled through it was not even encrypted. And that was not a mistake exactly. It was a decision. Why scramble everything moving through a cable lying at the bottom of the sea? Inside your own territorial waters, ringed by your own navy, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest enemy. Who could possibly reach it? So a great deal of that traffic ran through the cable in the clear. Plain voice, plain text. The everyday language of a superpower's military, spoken out loud into a wire they believed no one else could ever touch. For 10 years, someone was touching it. An American submarine had crept across the boundary into Soviet waters, found that cable in thousands of square kilometers of dark seabed, and settled down on top of it. Divers walked out into the near-freezing water and clamped a device the size of a man onto the line, a device that could listen to everything moving inside the cable without ever cutting it. They called it Operation Ivy Bells, and it may have been the single greatest signals intelligence operation of the entire Cold War. This is the story of how the most protected line in the Soviet military was undone by a single fatal assumption. The assumption that being hidden is the same as being safe. And of how, in the end, all of it was given away by one man for the price of a used car. If you saw our last video, you already know the first half of this story. You know about SOSUS, the wall of microphones the United States laid across the ocean floor to hear Soviet submarines the moment they left port. That was passive. Distant. Safe. America sat on its own side of the water and listened to the noise the Soviet fleet couldn't help making. But hearing a submarine leave is not the same as knowing where it's going, or why, or what its orders are. Hearing tells you a boat is out there. Reading tells you what its admiral just told it to do. SOSUS could hear the Soviet Navy. Ivy Bells was built to read it, to reach past the noise and into the actual words the Soviet High Command was saying to its own forces. And to do that, the safe, distant listening was not enough. Someone had to physically go and put a device on a Soviet military cable. Not near Soviet waters, inside them. In a sea the Soviet Navy considered its own private lake. The Sea of Okhotsk is almost completely surrounded by Russian land. To the Soviets in the 1970s, it was about as internal and protected a body of water as existed anywhere on Earth. Sending a submarine into it was not reconnaissance. It was walking into the enemy's house, into his most locked room, and standing there quietly while he spoke. The first boat sent to do the impossible was the USS Halibut. She was an ugly, strange-looking submarine, and that was the point. On the outside, she looked like an aging missile boat. Inside and underneath, she had been quietly rebuilt into something the world had never seen. A dedicated ocean floor spy, packed with cameras, side-scanning sonar, and a compartment full of intelligence analysts the crew were not allowed to ask about. But before she could tap a cable, she had to find one. And that is a problem that sounds simple and is almost insane. Think about the scale. The Sea of Okhotsk is enormous. Hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of dark, silted bottom. Somewhere down there lay a single cable, perhaps a few centimeters thick. There was no map that said where. There was no beacon. There was only deduction. So the Americans thought like the men who had laid the cable. If you run a critical line ashore, you don't want your own ships dropping anchor on it and tearing it up. So you warned them. Somewhere on the Soviet coast, the theory went, there would be a small, unremarkable sign facing the water telling mariners not to anchor here, because a cable comes ashore at this spot. Halibut crept along the coast, and her cameras found it. A plain sign on a lonely beach. Do not anchor. An arrow, in effect, pointing straight down to the most secret wire in the Soviet Far East. From that sign, they followed the cable out into the deep. And there, on the bottom of the Sea of Okhotsk, they found it. A Soviet military artery, lying exposed in the silt, humming with traffic, guarded by nothing but the certainty that no one would ever come. Now came the part that should not have been survivable. Halibut carried saturation divers, men who lived for days at a time in a pressurized chamber inside the submarine, their blood saturated with helium and oxygen, so their bodies could tolerate the crushing pressure outside. When it was time, they stepped out of the boat and into the open sea, on the bottom, in Soviet waters, in water cold enough to kill an unprotected man in minutes. They carried a device with them, the recording pod. The first version was around 6 feet long and weighed hundreds of kilograms, powered by batteries meant to last for weeks, and it was the whole reason any of this was happening. Later, as the operation grew, it would be replaced by something far larger and more ambitious. But we'll come back to that. Here is the elegant, ruthless genius of it. The device did not cut the cable. It did not splice into it. Cutting the line would have interrupted the traffic, and the moment the traffic stopped, the Soviets would have known something was wrong and sent a repair ship straight to the fault. Instead, the device used induction. When electrical signals move through a wire, they radiate a magnetic field around it. Wrap a coil around the outside of the cable, and that field induces a faint echo of the signal in your coil, without ever touching the conductor inside. You are not tapping the wire. You are reading the field it leaks into the water around it. The cable never knew it was being listened to. Not a single bit of traffic was interrupted. From the Soviet side, the line was working perfectly, exactly as it always had. The device recorded everything, every conversation, every report, every routine order, onto magnetic tape. Then the divers went back inside. The submarine lifted off the bottom, and it slipped back out of Soviet waters as quietly as it had come. And then, every few weeks, it would return. Retrieve the full tapes, leave fresh ones, do it again. As the years passed and the take proved its worth, the pod grew. The later version was a monster, reportedly around 6 meters long, weighing several tons, and no longer running on batteries at all. To power weeks of recording on the seabed, it carried a nuclear source, a radioactive heart sitting in the dark against a Soviet cable in Soviet waters, copying a superpower's secrets. For 10 years. Back in the United States, the tapes were a revelation. Because so much of the cable's traffic was never encrypted, American analysts often weren't fighting to break a code at all. They were simply listening to the Soviet military talk, in its own voice, in plain language, with its guard completely down. They heard the ordinary internal life of the Soviet Pacific Fleet, operational orders, after-action reports, discussions of readiness, of exercises, of what worked and what failed. The kind of traffic a military only ever sends when it is absolutely certain no enemy is in the room. And that is exactly what made it priceless. Encrypted messages are written carefully, defensively, in the knowledge they might be intercepted. This was different. This was the Soviet military speaking to itself, honestly, because it believed it was alone. And this was not just interesting, it was strategically decisive. The traffic gave the United States a direct read on how the Soviet Union operated its ballistic missile submarines, the boats that carried the nuclear deterrent. It helped confirm that Soviet missile subs could be tracked and, in a war, hunted, which shaped how the U.S. Navy prepared to fight. And it fed something quieter, but just as important: verification. When the two superpowers sat down to negotiate arms control agreements, each side needed a way to check that the other wasn't lying. Ivy Bells was one of the ways America could quietly test whether Soviet words matched Soviet actions. For years, the United States got an unfiltered window into how the Soviet Pacific Fleet actually thought and operated, its confidence and its weaknesses, its procedures and its fears. In the great chess game of the Cold War, one side had quietly been allowed to see the other player's hand, and the other player had no idea the cards were showing. The Soviet High Command kept speaking freely into that cable, day after day, year after year, never once suspecting that a machine the size of a man was lying against it in the dark, copying every word. The secret held not because it was technically unbreakable. It held because the target could not imagine it was possible. And here is the heart of it. The reason this story matters beyond the spycraft. The Soviet cable was not undefended by accident. It was undefended on purpose, because the people who ran it had confused two things that are not the same. They believed that because the cable was hidden, it was safe. Hidden and safe feel identical, right up until the moment they aren't. A locked door you can see, you defend. A door you're certain no one can find, you leave open. And the Soviet military left this one wide open. No encryption, no guard, no checks. For one reason, they could not picture an enemy submarine sitting on the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk in their own waters, patient enough to come back every few weeks for a decade. It was, in its own way, the exact same mistake the Alpha's designers made. The mistake we've traced across this whole series. The Soviets kept engineering brilliant, extreme solutions to the threats they could imagine and kept getting beaten by the threat they couldn't. They armored the wrong thing. The Americans didn't beat Soviet encryption, they never had to. They simply walked around the entire assumption the Soviet system was built on, that no one would ever be there to listen. Ivy Bells didn't defeat a lock. It proved there was no lock at all, only a belief that one wasn't needed. The most protected line in the Soviet Pacific Fleet was, in truth, the most exposed. It just took 10 years for anyone on the Soviet side to find out. Because in the end, the thing that broke Ivy Bells was not sonar. It was not a Soviet patrol that stumbled onto the submarine. It was not brilliant counterintelligence. It was a phone call from a man who needed money. His name was Ronald Pelton. He was a former analyst at the U.S. National Security Agency, a man who had worked on the inside, who understood exactly what programs like this were and how much they were worth. And by the end of the 1970s, he was broke. He had left the agency, he had filed for bankruptcy, and he had a memory full of some of the most valuable secrets on Earth. In 1980, he walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington and offered to sell what he knew. He had no documents. He didn't need them. He had something more dangerous, a trained intelligence analyst's memory of American operations against the Soviet Union. Among the things he described to the KGB was a program in which American submarines were recording a Soviet military cable on the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk. The price for one of the greatest secrets of the Cold War was around $35,000, the cost of a car. Not long after, an American submarine returned to the site and found it changed. The Soviets were there. They knew exactly where to look. They recovered the great nuclear-powered pod from the seabed, several tons of American technology and its radioactive core lifted out of their own waters. Proof of an operation that was never supposed to be provable. That device sits today in a museum in Moscow, the trophy of an operation betrayed not from the sea, but from within. In the end, it wasn't clever detective work that caught him either. In 1985, a senior KGB officer named Vitaly Yurchenko defected to the United States, and among the secrets he brought was the existence of an American walk-in who had sold out a Navy cable operation years before. That was enough. The FBI traced it to Pelton, arrested him, and convicted him. He was sentenced to life in prison for trading a decade of national secrets for the price of a used car. He was finally released in 2015, an old man having spent 30 years paying for $35,000. Step back and look at the whole shape of it. For a decade, the United States pulled off something that reads like fiction, sending men in submarines into the enemy's most private sea, laying a machine against his most secret wire, and quietly reading his mail while he never once looked over his shoulder. And it was ended not by any of the dangers the operation was built to survive, not by the cold, not by the pressure, not by Soviet sonar or Soviet patrols. It was ended by a single man an ocean away from the inside who put a price on it. There is something worth sitting with there. The operation was carried by men who volunteered to walk out onto the floor of a hostile sea, in the dark, in the cold, knowing that if anything went wrong, there would be no rescue and no acknowledgement. Men whose courage was total and whose names, mostly, we will never know. And it was undone by one man who never left a warm office and who sold their work for the smallest of reasons. Ivy Bells is remembered as a triumph of nerve and engineering, but the lesson underneath it is colder and simpler, and it did not belong only to the Soviets. Every secret depends on an assumption. And an assumption is the one part of any system you can never truly defend because you can't guard against a possibility you refuse to believe in. The Soviets refused to believe anyone could reach that cable. The Americans refused to believe one of their own would ever sell it. Both were certain. Both were wrong. And most importantly, any military action is a tragedy. Nothing is more valuable than human life. We study these machines and these operations not to glorify war, but to understand the cost of decisions and the price paid by the people who carried them out. If you want to understand that price, subscribe. See you in the deep.